When the church first began worshiping, Jesus is gone, they start worshiping, what are they going to do? We read in Acts that Peter and John, for example, were going to the temple every day to pray. There were prayer services at the temple and in various synagogues and so on. It was a regular event to have that. And the first half of a full Eucharistic liturgical service is essentially a replication of the ancient synagogue service, which was a service of scripture, of worship, and of teaching. And the worship consisted of antiphonal readings, so people, the cantor, someone would sing one part of, say, one verse of a psalm, and the people would sing another verse, and so on. So various forms of worship occurred, singing and spoken worship, acclaiming who God is, what He has done, and so on. And the church basically retained that form of worship, and for a long time they were going to the synagogues and to the temple to participate in the worship. And then what would happen is they would go to someone's private home for essentially the communion part of the service. So what you find is that just before the communion part of the service in a Eucharist service, whether you go to a Catholic or Lutheran or Anglican church, you'll see the same thing. There's a point where there's what's called the peace. Peace be with you. And people walk around and say, peace be with you, which essentially is the ancient Hebrew greeting, shalom. Peace be with you, which is, go well, have a good day, was the meaning of shalom. And so what happened is that the Christians were meeting with the Jews in the synagogue, have a full synagogue service, everyone says shalom to each other, and then they all go home. And what the Christians would then do is go and have a communion service at someone's house, which was normally a meal, and often it wasn't necessarily directly after the synagogue service. So what we find is by the end of the first century, it seems that the Christians were meeting for that kind of service early in the morning. Pliny the Younger talks about he's writing to the Emperor Trajan in about 112 AD, and he says, I've interviewed and tested some of these Christians, and he says they meet at daybreak and this is what they do. And basically they worship God and they have some teaching and they read the memoirs of the apostles. So at that point, the New Testament wasn't called the New Testament. And in fact, Justin Martyr explains that that's what they did in the first part of the service. And so early in the morning, the Christians would do that. And then in the evening, they would gather at someone's home and they would have a full meal. And of course, there were problems with the way they were practicing that in Corinth. And so in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, don't go there and scoff up all the food, especially because the weakest and the poorest, like the slaves, who are going to be led off very late from their masters and come very hungry, will have nothing to eat. And so there was a full meal around a Eucharist service. But what happened, and people have often wondered, why did the church suddenly start just having bread and wine? What happened to the meal? It's supposed to be a meal. And of course it was a meal. The Passover meal was a meal, and Jesus celebrated Passover as the first Eucharist service, if we want to call it that. But what happened is the Emperor Trajan was very concerned that the Persians were trying to infiltrate the empire. And so he invoked a very ancient law from the Senate from about 250 BC that allowed him to ban what were called supper clubs. So people were no longer allowed to gather for supper because he was worried that subversive elements were spreading insurrection through the empire. And so all supper clubs were banned. And so what the Christians did was they could no longer meet in the evening for their full celebration of communion with a meal. And so they added it on to the service in the morning at daybreak. And so what they would do, in the Roman Empire, your big meal was at dinner, and in the morning you'd eat a bit of water and a crust of bread, and you'd go off to do your day. And so they gathered, and they kept just the simplest form of breakfast now as their Eucharistic meal, which was essentially bread and a bit of wine. And so by the time that whole debacle had ended, this had become the norm, that the two parts, the synagogue type part of the service with the teaching and the worship, and the communion part of the service had been merged into one communion service early in the morning. And that was especially celebrated on the first day of the week, because that was the day of the resurrection. And so from the very early days, and that again we read in Justin Martyr, that it was specifically because this was the day Christ had risen from the dead, they always had a daybreak Eucharist service where they celebrated this. And so we ended up with just bread and wine and not a full meal. So that actually is the story behind why we don't have a full meal when we have the Eucharist now.